There's a job in music that involves tons of creativity, expertise, a chance to work with some of the top musicians on the planet, potentially even make lots of money. And if you're any good at it, you'll be doing all of that while making life-changing art that affects people all over the world, that can literally move people to tears. But if I told you this was a job that no one really wants, no one ever dreams of becoming, you don't find kids at school staring out of the window dreaming of this profession, you'd wonder what on earth I was talking about. Well, here are some examples of songs and pieces of music that use this profession. See if you can guess.
Get back here now!
Priest. Have a little priest.
Did you figure it out yet? We're talking about the job of music arranging, the art of taking an existing piece of music and giving it a fresh coat of paint. And if you're thinking that arranging doesn't sound very creative, it sounds like somebody repainting a house rather than a passionate artist with a unique vision, well, that's exactly the kind of thinking that deters people from considering arranging as a career. It's also often completely wrong. Perfect. By the end of the video, I hope to have convinced you that the humble act of arranging can be totally transformative. A good arranger can make a modest song into something amazing, and an amazing song into something even better. It's strange that music arranging has a pretty low reputation, because right back to the grandest of grand old masters, J.S. Bach himself, arranging music has been part of a composer's work. Here's an arrangement Bach did for solo organ of a concerto by Vivaldi. And it works well, although if this video is anything to go by, it seems to need an organist who has 3 hands. This was perhaps more of a charity makeover. Few people in Bach's day were lucky enough to hear an orchestra, so part of the idea behind such arrangements was simply to allow more people to actually hear the work in some form. It was an approach which continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, with the rise of pianist composers like Franz Liszt here, who made piano transcriptions of, say, Beethoven's symphonies, allowing the audience to hear the pieces for the very first time.
There's also the reverse process, where a piece that was written for, say, piano is written into like an orchestral piece. And paradoxically, it had the same kind of orchestra, but in reverse. Satie's The Melody, for example, were only brought to the attention of a wider public when they heard in Debussy's orchestral version. So they got out of it.
One of the most celebrated pieces of this kind of traditional arrangement is Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. But to me it provides a bit of a cautionary tale as far as arrangements go. Mussorgsky wrote the series of 10 short piano pieces very quickly in 1874, but they were only published 5 years after his death. Each of the 10 movements has a distinctive and atmospheric colour, so they quickly became an obvious target for an orchestral arrangement. The race was on to make the most successful arrangement. The early leader was Mikhail Tushmalov, but he was soon caught by the creativity of Prom's founder Henry Wood. But the first prize ended up going to Maurice Ravel, who made his version in 1922, after which Henry Wood withdrew his own version and banned future performances of it in deference to Ravel's skills. It's not hard to love Ravel's version. It's not just his obviously god-tier skill with an orchestra, it's the way he brings out little moments that go unnoticed in some other versions. Compare this passage from Tushmalov's arrangement. With this one by Ravel. There's a powerful little swell of emotion that creates a moment, an atmosphere that's just not there in the Tushmalov version. But Ravel's version is a good example of how arranging can reveal as much about the arranger as about the original composition. Here's conductor and composer Tomasz Golka, who made his own arrangement of the piece.
In the case of Mussorgsky Ravel pictures, one must constantly choose between Russian aesthetics from the 1870s and French aesthetics from the 1920s.
Ravel as an artist comes from a very different time and place to Mussorgsky, and his instincts are inevitably a little different. Take the Old Castle movement, for example. Moody chords and a haunting solo line. What's the best way to arrange this? Ravel opts for a lilting saxophone solo. It sounds sultry and wonderful, but it's hard to imagine it's a choice Mussorgsky himself would have made. Tushmalov opts for the cor anglais, which is a safe choice. But my personal favourite is Henry Wood's choice of an off-stage euphonium. Ravel's arrangement overall is polished and sophisticated, like Ravel himself, and there's no doubt audiences have loved it over the years, but you can't help feeling it's smoothed over a few of Mussorgsky's more interesting, rough edges. The point is that arranging can achieve wonderful things, but it's always going to be bringing with it the characteristics of both the arranger and the time and the place that they're arranging in, and sometimes those things will be very different from the original. The time between Mussorgsky's death and Ravel's arrangement saw the birth of a new art form, jazz. And in jazz, arrangements were rather the norm than the exception. You can map the different styles of music in the 20th century by watching what kind of arranging goes on. Take the famous jazz standard Autumn Leaves, for example. It might start out as a crooner ballad,
Sunburned hand.
become a Liberace-esque cheese fest in the hands of someone like Roger Williams, or in the jazz styles of bebop, fusion and beyond, the tune becomes barely audible among the stream of notes. Although it could still be lots of fun. I'm skipping over a lot of arranging that goes on in jazz, especially big band arranging, because I'm really concerned with why people arrange. And I think it's fair to say that even through the changing styles of jazz, the philosophical reasons are largely the same. Is that true? Let me know in the comments if I'm talking rubbish. What I will say is that you can definitely see some of the reasons people don't aspire specifically to be arrangers. In jazz, people like Cy Oliver, Fletcher Henderson and Billy Strayhorn literally invented the big band sound, but rarely get the recognition that they deserve. And the same is true in the theatre and film worlds, where a lot of jazz arrangers ended up. Who outside those worlds knows the name of, say, Jonathan Tunick, who orchestrated many of Sondheim's shows, or the countless minions, as Vanity Fair recently called them, who orchestrate and sometimes even compose for the named composers on Hollywood films. There's one arranging trick that probably first emerged in jazz and gradually also took hold in popular music, and that's what you might call the mood switch, where you take the emotional settings of the original and flip them over, leaving you with the same melody but a very different atmosphere. Probably the earliest jazz mood switch I can think of is the classic Body and Soul, written by Johnny Green. The original is melancholy and introspective.
My heart is sad and lonely,
becoming cool and slinky in Coleman the Hawkins' version. More extreme kinds of switches have become a surefire way to get noticed in the pop world. As well as on reality TV and even here on YouTube. It's strange that where arrangements in Bach's time used to be a way of giving more attention to the composition, they now become a way to piggyback on the success of a famous tune. Plenty of bands and singers have found their first taste of success with a well-chosen arrangement of a famous track, and where it can sometimes be a bit cheesy, other times it can be a revelation.
Oh, I get by with a little help. I'm gonna get by with my friends.
So now we're starting to stray over the border a little, not just arranging in the sense that Bach or Liszt or Ravel would understand it, but adding our own twist to the recipe, or quite literally dancing to a different beat. One of Liszt's successors in the world of virtuosic pianist composers was a man named Leopold Godowsky, and he was an arranger who did something so much more than just put old notes on new instruments. Critic Ernest Newman said of him,
"He has a remarkable facility for drawing out of another man's work something that was not formally expressed by the man, but that was latent in his work."
Godowsky's form of creativity seemed to thrive most when he was adding herbs and spices to another composer's work, so you might have tasted this recipe, Chopin's Minute Waltz. Godowsky's version of the same meal is packed full of extra spices and flavours. It's an approach in a way that's closer to the thinking of a jazz arranger, and if you like your cuisine a little more modern, there's another chef who does almost exactly the same thing but in a much more contemporary way.
Don't you worry about a thing. Don't you worry about a thing.
Jacob Collier made his name with extravagant arrangements of old tunes, and often adds extremely rich and multi-layered harmonies and textures over the top, turning something familiar, like say the Christmas carol In the Bleak Midwinter, into a fantastical, many-coloured beast. Collier and Godowsky alone are great examples of how arranging can be so much more than just taking some notes from the piano and sticking them on something else, like, say, a string quartet. It can radically alter the entire feel of the work and become a complete artistic object in its own right. And it's sometimes surprising how few of the ingredients you need to change. Just as modern chefs take traditional regional cuisine, maybe deconstruct it or add a shockingly modern twist, so classical composers find new expression in old pieces, often keeping many of the original notes intact. Stravinsky did it in Pulcinella, and see my video about artists stealing for more on that. Luciano Berio did it with his wonderful folk songs, which add the tiniest of quirky modernist twists to the traditional recipe. And more recently, Thomas Ades's arrangements of Couperin, to mix a metaphor, feel like some kind of oral kaleidoscope. The original is still there, but it's deeply changed. To me, this is one of the best examples of a work that might only technically be called an arrangement, but is as beautiful a creation as anything Ades has done, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way. These are all examples of pieces where the voice of the arranger takes on a stronger role. If Ravel's arrangement was, as it were, accidentally 1920s French, Ades is more knowing about the anachronistic nature of his arranging. He's not making any attempt to hide that he's operating in a very different time and place. We see the original, but through the fragmented window of the present.
I've looked at love from both sides now.
Our final example didn't have such issues of authenticity, because the singer in the original and the arrangement were one and the same person. But before we look at that, let me just say that I made some arrangements of my own recently for a sort of classical supergroup, the Between Worlds Ensemble. And I've made a video which is available to my patrons over on Patreon, where I talk about the process of arranging some Italian folk songs and some of the lessons I learned. So if you're interested, do sign up there and you'll be supporting the channel in the process. Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now was one of her first and most popular tracks when it first came out back in the 1960s.
But now old friends, they're acting strange. They shake their heads, they say, I've changed. Well, something's lost, but something's gained in living every.
But the new version, which she recorded and performed live in the year 2000, added layers of emotion which a lot of listeners found overwhelming.
Now, old friends, they're acting strange. And they shake their heads and they tell me that I've changed. Well, something's lost, but something's gained in living every day.
Apparently not just reaction vloggers, but the orchestra themselves during the recording process were brought to tears by the power of the new version. The hankies were out apparently.
Yeah.
The impetus for the arrangement came from Mitchell herself.
I saw Mabel Mercer do it in her 70s, and I thought it was a wonderful performance, and I went back to tell her, I said, you know, I've heard that song performed by a lot of people. I didn't tell her I was the author, you know. I said, but it takes somebody your age to pull it off. And she went, huh?
I've looked at love from both sides now.
21 when I wrote it, I took a lot of ridiculing for it. I was just miscast in it, I think, as a young girl. That I really liked the performance I did in my 50s of it.
So Mitchell called up arranger Vince Mendoza, who recast the song completely from its solo guitar origins into a new version for full orchestra. It starts in a very nostalgic space with a single 5-note motive weaving in and out of itself. It's like a sort of dreamscape.
Rose and flows of angel hair.
The arrangement here forms a sort of cloudy backdrop which perfectly sets off the solo line. As Mitchell suggested, she was now in her late 50s and with a voice enriched by the depths of life's experience and tinged with the husky timbre of 1,000 cigarettes. The song lyrics take on an added poignancy that just wasn't possible for her when she was back in her 20s.
Oh, but now it's just another show, and you leave them laughing when you go.
When the orchestra climaxes towards the end of the song, it feels as though the emotion has become too much. Words, even sung words, are no longer enough, and the instruments must take the weight of the expression. When extra layers of emotion and meaning are stacked on top of the original, that's surely when arranging can be said to be a truly worthy profession. And whilst we're on the subject of arrangements, you can check out my video here, where I arranged a piece of electronic music that was originally written for the OP1 by Jeremy Blake from the Red Means Recording YouTube channel, and made a version for full orchestra, which you can see on that video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.